This is John Immerwahr, and in today's visit we'll talk about African Americans in art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We'll focus on a few examples from the 19th century, including works by African Americans and paintings by white artists of African American life. I'll visit the museum's rich collection of modern and contemporary African American artists in another video. When visitors come to the American Wing, they're often fascinated by this portrait of Yarrow Mamout by Charles Willson Peale. You immediately feel his warmth and kindness. A college student said it this way: "You can see what old age has brought to Yarrow, but you can also see what Yarrow has brought to old age." He was a Muslim, captured in West Africa in the 1750s, sold to slave traders, shipped across the Atlantic in the inhuman conditions of a slave ship, and ended up in Georgetown, where, after 40 years, he worked out a deal with his owner to obtain freedom by extra hard work. After gaining his freedom, he eventually owned a home and had money in the bank. He became well known in Georgetown, as we can see from this other portrait, always wearing a head covering in the Muslim tradition, praying and reciting the Quran. Charles Willson Peale heard that Yarrow was 134 years old. He was actually in his 80s. And Peale wanted to learn the secret to his longevity. Peale also had a museum with pictures of famous people such as presidents and objects of scientific curiosity. Peale went to Washington to paint a portrait of one of the United States presidents, and while there, he also met Yarrow. He was so struck by Yarrow's strength of character and his positive spirit that he painted Yarrow's portrait. It's one of Peale's finest portraits, as you can see by comparing it to the D.C. Library portrait. Peale hung the portrait in his museum alongside his portrait of presidents. He went to Yarrow to learn how to live a long life, but he learned how to live a good life, even in the face of harsh conditions. Our next artist found a subtle way, as an enslaved person, to push back against those hard conditions. Let's look at this huge jar, created in South Carolina in 1859 by an enslaved man known as Dave the Potter. It's technically an impressive piece of pottery in its own right, but what's interesting is that Dave wrote his name on this pottery, although it was illegal in South Carolina for enslaved people to read and write. Even more interesting is that on the other side of the jar he wrote a poem. It's hard to read in the photo, but the first line says, "Good for lard or holding fresh meat." Would you risk your life to write that line? Probably not. But look at the next line. "Blessed we were when Peter saw the folded sheet." What's that about? We know that the enslaved people spoke in coded language, and the best codes were taken from the Bible, since no one could object to slaves singing about biblical stories. For example, it's said that Harriet Tubman, who helped many people escape slavery via the Underground Railroad, sometimes used the phrase, "Go down Moses," as a password. This, of course, was a reference to the song, "Go Down Moses." This song is overtly about the book of Exodus, but it really sings of American slavery and the hope for liberation. In the same way, Dave's poem references a passage in the biblical book Acts of the Apostles, where Peter has a vision of a sheet with different kinds of animals, answering his question of whether Jews and non-Jews might eat together. To one who did not know the scripture well, this might seem to be of little relevance to slavery in 19th century South Carolina. But someone who really knew the Bible, as Dave did, would know that this is a revolutionary passage, where for the first time in the New Testament, the Christian message is understood as universal, inclusive of all people, not just limited to the Jewish community. A few verses later, Peter says that God has commanded him not to call anyone impure or unclean, which is a radical statement in South Carolina at this time, when slavery was often justified by claiming that the enslaved people were not fully human, literally unclean and impure. Dave's coded message, with its seemingly obscure reference, thus has a deeper meaning. Outside of the slave states, there was a long-standing African-American and often multiracial middle class, as we can see from these portraits of Hiram and Elizabeth Monteer, painted in 1841 by Franklin Street. The paintings are believed to be the oldest known paintings of a married African-American couple. The first mayor of colonial Philadelphia had an African-American servant. She and the mayor's son fell in love and lived openly together and had many children and descendants, including their grandson, Hiram. He became a prominent and well-to-do bootmaker. We see him here elegantly dressed. I really like his tie pin. And he was depicted reading one of his many books. His bride, Elizabeth, is wearing a cross that signifies that they are Christians. She's also holding a book to indicate that she is well educated. Their portraits remind us that slavery was only one part of the African American story in the 19th century. The museum is very fortunate to have several works of art by one of the most important American painters of the 19th century. He's Henry Ossawa Tanner, an African American, shown here in a portrait by his teacher, Thomas Akins. Although he grew up and studied art in Philadelphia, he lived most of his life in Europe to escape the racial discrimination he found in America. Let's start by looking at this portrait of George Burnham, done not by Tanner, but by Cecilia Beaux, another Philadelphia painter. It shows what I might call his public face, showing off his beautiful clothing and his lovely garden. He's an educated person, he's reading, as we see, and obviously very comfortable with himself. But now, let's compare it to the picture that hangs right next to it in the museum, Tanner's portrait of his own mother. Instead of her public face, Tanner has captured the moment where she's gone into herself, reflecting on her life. By this time, she was the wife of a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but as a child she had escaped from South Carolina via the Underground Railroad. Do you see a small square in the corner of the painting? Tanner is suggesting a relationship to another well-known painting, Whistler's Arrangement in Gray and Black, sometimes called Whistler's Mother. You can see the similarities in the pose, in the white bonnet on Mrs. Whistler and the white scarf on Mrs. Tanner. And each room has a picture on the wall. And yet, to my way of thinking, there's a big difference. Where Whistler's mother seems cold and aloof, Sarah Tanner seems reflective and compassionate. But why is this painting so dark? Some people think that Tanner is reminding us that while most of America is oppressive for him, his mother and his family stand out as an island of love. Before turning to one of Tanner's greatest works, look at this 15th century picture of the Annunciation. This is the moment in the Christian story where an angel appears to Mary and announces that although she is a virgin, she will give birth to a child, Jesus, who will be the Son of the Most High. The museum has many paintings of that scene, and Mary is usually shown as a wealthy European woman. Tanner wants to move away from that vision. Here's his vision.
Mary had a baby.
He sees Mary as a young girl in first-century Palestine, waking from sleep to see not a physical angel with fancy clothing and wings, but a column of light. The arches and the fabrics locate the scene in the Middle East. What's the expression on Mary's face? Is the tilt of her head suggesting that this is the moment where she asks the angel how it is possible for her to have a child? Or is this the moment where she says yes to God's plan? Notice also how the column of light intersects the shelf on the wall, giving us an image of a cross. Tanner symbolically suggests Jesus' birth and Jesus' death in the same moment. It's a much more grounded understanding of this pivotal moment, making us understand how Mary, a peasant girl, might have felt about this experience. We've seen some of the most important examples from the 19th century. Early in 2021, the museum will complete a major reinstallation that will showcase many of the museum's extensive holdings in modern and contemporary work by African American artists. I hope to see you at the museum then, and thanks for joining me today.